Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry DeSilva. Today we have a gentleman who's joining us from down in the Lone Star State, who's going to be talking to us a little family and relationship, self-help. Gentleman's name, author, therapist John Lee. John is a well-known author, and for over 30 years, John has been guiding people through addictions, recovery, and grief into strength and fulfillment. This is a copy of one of his more recent books, a book called Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic, Resetting the Patterns of a Man's Life and Love. So and actually this is something too that ladies can probably gain some insight and some tips. It's just not about, men in general. So I think it'll be beneficial for both parties. John, his book is published by Health Communications, Inc. Also websites for more information, www.johnleebooks.com, as well as hcibooks.com. John, welcome to Studio 411. How are you, sir?
Good morning. I'm doing good. Thank you. And yourself?
Doing well. Tell me now, this book, again, probably you've written over 20 books at this point, so I won't even ask you what number book this is. But what was the inspiration for this particular book?
Money.
Okay.
Money. No, I'm just kidding. No. This was something that people have been asking for a long time. I've focused a lot on fathers and sons, but I never really delved into mothers and sons and the impact that mothers have on their sons, either by being too close and what they call helicopter parenting, or too far and having abandoned them. And over the last 35 years of counseling, I realized I've just seen so many men that had poor relationships with their lovers and wives and girlfriends because of some unfinished business with the way they were raised and maybe still connected to their mothers.
Now, in reading the book, I thought to myself, well, what is the percentage that you would say of people, in this case men, that would fit under this category? I would think that there is no one that has had the absolute pristine, tremendous relationship. I would think that there would be issues of some level in all mother-son relationships.
You would think that, but in most men's consciousness and thoughts, they will not believe until they're forced to believe that they have some kind of mother issue. The average man, which I've worked with thousands of them now over the years, the average man, if I said, so what kind of relationship did you have with your mother? They would say, oh, it was great. She's the greatest thing in the world. She's an angel. I don't know what I would do without her. And so to get them to see that they're not on that pedestal, or get them to take them off and look at how they influence their relationships or lack thereof. But most men won't go there. The truth is Robert Bly and I, he was a poet and sort of leader of the men's movement back in the 80s. He and I did a big event in Chicago, and we did a Saturday and a Sunday. And on Saturday, it was a father-son day in which we talked about that wound. There was 500 people there. Now, on Sunday, the second day, we did mothers and sons, and there was 70 people.
So it's less, obviously, because more men are in denial. What about from the mother's standpoint? I mean, what if this book was being addressed too directly, and the publicity for an event like that was really keyed in on women? Do you think women would respond, or would they be, oh, that doesn't apply to me?
Well, again, many women would say it doesn't apply, but I can tell you this. I've gotten a ton of emails from women who have said essentially this. I wish I had have read this book when my son was 5 instead of the fact that he's 45 now. Because in a very gentle way, not in a harsh way, I just point out some things that most mothers were not taught about how to be with their sons. And the truth is the reason why I wrote that book as much for the sons is for potential mothers to see how they might sidestep some of these mistakes that a lot of moms have made trying to do the best they could.
Now, as you see it, how do you define the, as you call it in the book, the mother-son matrix or dynamics?
Okay, well, it's kind of twofold. One is that the mother is too present and very often using the son as a surrogate for an absent husband. She uses him sometimes as a counselor, a confidant. The truth is, my mother was telling me problems about her life and marriage by the time I was 5. People have said for years, where did you get your counseling experience? And I said, at home with my mother, and we found a lot of women who have turned to sons when the husband or father was absent. The second category is the mother who is not there. The mother who is not there. And somehow or another, either through drugs, alcohol, addiction, depression, she was gone. And now that has a huge impact because men are going to be looking for the mother they never had.
Right. I'm reminded in reading this book, and of course then I thought, well, maybe this is why script writers tailor this through the history of film and television, but I'll give you an example from television. Very successful show back in the 90s and early 2000s, Everybody Loves Raymond. You have this mother that these are my words, and I don't profess to be the expert, but certainly domineering, if not pushy, and I'm sure there could be stronger words than that. And yet it's was very successful, still plays well today. And I just wonder if one of the reasons for the success of that show, besides the talented actors, is that men and women or people in general relate to that character in her interaction, not just with one son, but with 2 sons as well as the daughter-in-law. Very pushy, very domineering. Any correlation, or am I just like imagining it?
No, well, one thing that happened, especially for my generation and a little bit younger and a little older, who was watching that show, there was this sort of unconscious, unspoken agreement between the father and the mother. And the unconscious agreement was the father would be in charge of the work, the money, buying the house, whatever, and then the rest, mother was in charge. Everything else. As long as the father put a roof over the head, clothes on the back, food on the table, mother got to say all this other. And I would hear as a kid, maybe you did too, the father who was tired and exhausted from work, you'd ask him a question, he'd just look at you and say, go ask your mother.
That also could be because, again, in some cases, the men were ill-equipped or felt very uncomfortable even addressing that, especially, I would think, more with their daughters. But I think in general, if they didn't bond with their kid, or a lot of it could have been from how they were raised, they were ill-equipped or totally inept at even approaching that, whereas the mothers kind of had a better feel, for any number of reasons.
See, that was the other thing. Dad was in charge of anger.
And discipline.
And mother was in charge of feelings. Yeah,
he was the disciplinarian, like in my case, and then the mother was the one that was easygoing, at least in my case. I can't say that in my case, just as an example, that there was, heavy discussion going on whether, someone perhaps might have been out of work at one period of time, or, laid off for the season, whatever, or if there were financial issues. I mean, you might have been aware of them, but to be honest with you, as a kid, and I was an only child, so I don't even know if this book is tailored more for parents and children from one child families, or if what you're saying would apply with multiple kids?
All the above.
Yeah.
Solo children and many children. There's usually, though, one son, and it's very often the oldest or the only child,
Right.
really develops what we call an enmeshed relationship with the mother in many ways. It's that this word, they've almost got a symbiotic relationship where, they don't know where one begins and the other one ends. And that's largely, now, things have changed a little bit, Larry, not a lot, but a little bit. Fathers are more present in the home and in child rearing today. But there's still a lot of men, especially rural men, southern men everywhere in the world, that is still primarily going to be in the workforce. Moms are too, but they still end up taking care of the children in ways the father does not.
Right. John Lee joining us, author, therapist. The book Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic by HCI Publications. For more information on John and his work, johnleebooks.com, and on this book, hcipublishing.com. You talk in the book, you say that men need to separate from their mother. How so and why? And at what point? Later in life, perhaps, once they get to kind of to where they can fend for themselves?
Well, the truth is that separation, both for boys and girls, begins around 2 years old. And if there's a functional family, God knows if we could find them, we sure would like to watch them for a while. But if there is a functional family, that separation process will be smoother, more functional, healthier, and by the time a boy or a girl is 12 or 13 years old, that separation is really, really in place, so that when they go off to college, they're no longer in this enmeshed symbiotic relationship. Now, the problem with the young people of today is other than my generation, those same kids don't get to separate. They're still entwined, and half of them are living in their mother's attic or their mother's basement or in the bedroom that they had when they were a kid. But it's important in all cultures, and all cultures, even ours to a degree, recognizes that once adolescence hit, you're supposed to be on your journey towards adulthood. But really what a lot are doing is dragging mama along with them, or mama's holding on to them and holding them back because they don't want to see their 40-year-old baby leave.
Well, again, to go back to the Raymond example I gave you, there was an example on that show where, the mother lives across the street. And, of course, at first everybody, oh, yeah, no big deal. Well, it becomes a big deal because they're always, present. It's like you can't escape them. Other than the bedroom and perhaps the bathroom, the implication is that the hovering is always there. I've heard the term helicopter parents more as it relates to, for instance, the way over these last 30 years that teachers or the interaction between parents and teachers or whatever. I got to tell you, maybe because my parents were from Europe and emigrated over here, their motto was, we don't want to hear from the school, point blank. Okay, that was a one-sentence statement. Helicopter parents now, I hear of people actually challenging college professors, and I'm looking at them like, are you kidding me? So, that's my interpretation of helicopter parenting. Obviously, it must be evolving into where, whether it's, I'll give you another example. You hear in the news assaults, even near tragedies happening on softball, baseball courts because, confrontations between coaches and parents. Are you kidding me? This is not rocket science here. Who wins and loses that game is really not going to matter at the end of the day. But they get so obsessed that I assume that's the kind of helicoptering you're talking about.
Well, they start that from early on usually. And helicopter parenting very often is driven by anxiety, that they're afraid to let their kids go out. So now you got to ride a bike, you got to have a helmet, you got to have knee pads, you got to have elbow pads, and you got to make sure that you've got your cell phone so that you can call your mother if you fall down. Now, some of that obviously is very good stuff, but that's the way the child is raised, and it keeps going that way. But that's the way, in a way, it's always been, Larry. Most of the people that I graduated from school with in my small rural town in Alabama, most of them live a block away from their parents, a mother, around the corner like you're talking about, or certainly no more than 20 or 30 miles so they can get there at the drop of a hat if they need to. Most people believe that they're supposed to stay with their parents, and parents say, mothers particularly will say, you are always gonna be my baby. But Mom, I'm 67 years
Exactly,
old.
yeah. Do you find that that's more prevalent nowadays? I'll give you another kind of TV example, a very well-known show I'm sure you grew up watching it, The Waltons. Grandma, grandpa, until they ultimately succumbed and passed away, lived there because, again, the depression, tough times, et cetera, et cetera. Now, yeah, we think we have tough times now, but they're in a different way. Now it's like we're living there because the state of living, or the state of young adults being able to sustain themselves is the word I'm looking for, by providing for themselves becomes increasingly more difficult. So they wind up moving in with the parents. So you have this nuclear family, but it's really not for the same reasons.
Well, not only that, you don't have the grandparents there. The grandparents are either in Florida or on the West Coast sunning. But see, in the Waltons, you had the extended family. Now, in my generation, where I grew up, I had aunts, uncles, and grandparents that we weren't living together, but we all were very close. And my aunts raised me almost as much as my mother did, and my grandfather certainly did. Now, in all indigenous cultures that still left, what few there are, grandparents are the ones who are supposed to be raising the kids. And therefore, they're supposed to be the buffer between the mother and son, or the father and daughter. But grandparents have pretty much abdicated their role as, figures, authority figures, or it goes the other way, and they tend to involve themselves too much in the raising of their grandkids.
Interesting. And I was going to say, grandparents today, these last several decades, they have tended to become younger than, of course, the ones like, for instance, I didn't know my grandfathers, knew both my grandmothers, but at that point in time, they were quite elderly, whereas now, you could have a great-grandmother, do the math, it could be 45 years old or 40 or 50 years old if you play it right, but that's for another show. So, John Lee, author, therapist, joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic. For more information on John and his work, johnleebooks.com, as well as Health Communications Inc. Or HCIbooks.com. All right, now let's see. We've talked about all the generational stuff, but tell me a little bit about, in the book you talk about the ghost mother. What is that?
Well, that's the mother that still haunts men well after maybe they're dead, or well after the mother is very old. So like when I'm trying to work with a man who has some mother-son wounding, it's very hard, especially if the mother is still alive or just recently passed. So I came up with this idea that essentially says, listen, the mother that we're going to work on is gone. We're going to work on your mother issues when your mother was 25, 30 45. Not this kindly old lady down in Tampa, Florida that's 85. No, that's not the mother that you're still carrying around and is haunting your relationships and possibly your progress in your marriage. So think of the young woman and think of even that young woman being a ghost, but she still haunts you.
I've seen situations, and it made me think of that when you were just making that last statement. I hear people saying, well, you know, this person, be it in Florida or Arizona or out on the West Coast, wherever they may or they might just be, you know, a couple of counties down, and all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, you know, when there's grandkids involved, they take on a totally different persona. Obviously, I understand why, because it's no longer their sole responsibility. But that the son or daughter wind up looking at them and saying things like, wait a minute, you know, all of a sudden, like, this isn't the same person I remember that raised me. Is that just because there isn't that same dynamic, or is it they've just like learned and have learned to back off?
Yeah, no, exactly. Now, let me give you an example of what you're saying there that I've worked with a million times. When a son is in the home with the father and the mother, the older that son gets, the more tension there is between the father and son. And it's almost like there's a competition going on for the mother's attentions and affections. And so if the mother keeps that going, then the father gets angry and either takes it out on the son or kind of abandons the relationship. Now, the grandparents don't have that inherent tension anymore. They had it with their kids, but they don't have it with their grandkids because they're significantly older. In these families, real separation should be that the father and the mother sees their child's star ascending as theirs is descending. And that gives full separation. The only problem is now is we have this incredible extended adolescent period where the 60-year-old, the 70-year-old either tries to look 20 years younger or looks 20 years younger. And so there's a lot of confusion with roles that weren't there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Sure thing. Now, in the book, you examine your own mother-son relationship. Tell us a little bit of that, and you know, did you learn anything about your own situation? Even though obviously you're a very learned person, you've obviously helped a lot of people in your career. But in writing this book, did you kind of all of a sudden peel back a layer or two and say, wow, you know, even I better understand what was going on there?
Yeah. No, I had to peel back about 20 layers.
Okay.
And maybe 25. I lost count somewhere. But generally speaking, all my books, Larry, are first based on, okay, I got to look at my stuff first. Then I got to hear my clients and workshop participants. Then I got to go out and lecture to helping professionals. And then I write a book. So I put like 3 components, but it's always grounded in mind. So like my first book, The Flying Boy, that came out, that was me looking at how much damage and how wounded I was between myself and my father, who was a workaholic, alcoholic, and who essentially was absentee fathering. But that book launched people into going, oh my gosh, yeah, some of the same stuff applies to me and my father. Well, the same thing with here. My mom and I were intertwined so deeply, we were so enmeshed, that I'm going to tell you how bad it was in 1 minute, though I have a book that's filled with it. When I would break up with a girlfriend in my teens, 20s, and even right up to my early 30s, who would I call?
Mom.
My mama, my mama would say things like, "Oh, honey, that girl doesn't deserve you. Oh, honey, there's a better woman out there for you. Oh, honey, maybe someday you'll find a woman." And then we even had a song back in the 20s, "I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old dad."
Gotcha.
Now, if that's not sort of psychologically incestuous, I don't know what is. And that's what my mother and I. Now, we worked on it as I worked on it, and finally we pulled out of that arrangement, but not till I was about 40.
And now, did she come to understand better? In other words, that there was a, I don't know if problem's the right word, but a situation?
Right. Well, one of the things that I got that a lot of men never get to hear, my mother apologized deeply and sincerely to me in my 40s for not being a buffer or an intervener in the abuse that I was receiving from my father. She just sort of abdicated that. And so one time I said to her, I said, "You know, if you had have taken us to Grandpa and Grandma and told them how their son was behaving, then Grandpa and Grandma might have stepped in and buffered it." I said, why didn't you do that? And she said, "Well, honey, I hate to say this." Again, now I'm talking to a 60-year-old mother. I didn't want his mom and dad to know how bad things were. And I said, "So you let us kids know how bad things were." And she said, "And I'm deeply, deeply sorry that I didn't come between some of that." Now, see, that's also, just as an aside, that's the father's job, that he tends to abdicate, to come in and buffer the son from all that mother demand and all that mother energy and all that mother need. But he's gone, so it comes straight right into the son.
And some of that, again, I'm not saying it doesn't happen today, but obviously circumstances were different. Some of it is financially driven, meaning, in other words, maybe we're not talking upper class, middle, lower class, dirt poor, whatever the scenarios may be. Obviously, it sounds like she was 20-ish when she had you. You could make the argument that, just like my standing argument that I say to people, once I get to know them a little bit, I'll say, "Well, when your parents or when you got married, how old were you?" And they say, "Well," and I say, "Were you between 17 and 25?" And when they say yes, it's like 90 percentile divorce. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I do know some people where they've been married 30, 40, 50 years. But again, emotionally, mentally, whatever, people are not ready for that.
They were children.
Yeah. So then imagine now they've been thrust into parenthood, and that's just, to me, compounding the situation, of which I am guilty as well, and therefore, the results that occurred. So again, it's not like I'm talking out of my hat. So.
Yeah. See, my mom was 17 when she married my dad, who was 19. From a little rural 500 population town with no self-help bookstore in the 40s. So what I do is I tell folks, listen, we're going to start right from the beginning and say, I truly believe that your mother and father did the best they could with what they had. Now, we're going to take that fact, we're going to put it in a little box, we're going to tie it up with a bow, and we're going to stick that in the closet. And now we're going to deal with that 20-year-old mother, that 25-year-old father, and deal with the pain and the hurt that they maybe didn't even intentionally or maliciously mete out, but you still got to deal with it sometime. Then, as you deal with it and you feel like you've gotten some real success, then you bring that box back out, you open it, and you put it with the reality of what happened, and then you get to see your parents as the human beings that we all are, which is fallible.
John Lee, author, therapist, joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic, Resetting the Pattern of a Man's Life and Loves. For more information, johnleebooks.com. Also published by Health Communications, Inc., hcibooks.com. I wanted to mention, too, and not to get too much on a religious bent here, or religious kind of bashing, which might be perceived as such, but some of the current reality trend, which I think can be helpful in some regards, but when you have these families due to either medical intervention or whatever, where they have 10, 20 kids, it sounds to me like if there's any of this going on, that, as you said before, maybe the first two sons or maybe the latter couple might be ones that suffer from it. What I see with a lot of times with these huge families, and I think it's great to a certain degree. There are others that feel strongly opposed to it, but I guess it's a matter of choice, that after about the fifth, sixth, seventh child, then they're old enough to almost start being forced into the role of taking care of the kids, which now I'm like, wait a minute, so now you've got a 10-year-old young girl who's being almost like a surrogate mother, and I don't know, how healthy is that, or there's
not much,
no.
But that does happen
Yeah.
a whole lot. People will tell me, I don't really have major issues with my mom. I have major issues with my sister, who is 10 years older than me, and she was just a child raising a child.
Right.
To get back to something, let me tell you two very quick little stories that explains the heart and soul of this book and this work we're talking about, okay?
Okay.
Quick. The Round Table, the King Arthur myth. There is a man named Parsifal, and all his brothers and fathers went to war and got killed. So his mother wants him to stay at home no matter what. Please don't leave me, son. Well, he sees a knight riding through town with its armor and sword, and he goes to his mother and says, I've got to go to do this. I've got to get some armor. I've got to get some feathers and a sword. Long story short, his mother says, but that's going to break my heart if you leave me, honey. Don't leave me. You're all I got. So he says, I'm going anyway. So the mother says, before you go, I'm going to knit for you a very fine garment that is mother-made, and you're going to wear that under your armor, so that everywhere you go, you're going to take your mom with you. And that's the story of Parsifal. He does take that fine garment, and he does do serious damage out in the world at first, because he and the mother are still too intimately connected.
Very good, very good. Now, speaking of being too interconnected, another theme that I got when reading the book was a statement you made that always have your wife, partner, whatever the title may be, have their back when dealing with mothers. Obviously, I think most people would be able to draw the conclusion as to why, but give me an example of maybe in your situation, or someone that you've dealt with that has had that problem.
The truth is when I was young and I would take a girlfriend home for dinner or Christmas or something, we would leave. The girlfriend would be mad, and she would say something like, when your mother said so-and-so, I knew that wasn't true, and I said it wasn't true, and then I looked at you, and you sided with your mother. I think if it came down between me and your mother, you would take your mother over me, hands down. That's what a lot of boys and men have heard. What I tell men now, I say, and have for 30 years, listen, if your mother is sitting having dinner and says, it's a beautiful day, and your girlfriend or wife says, no, it's cloudy and it's going to rain, you say, yes, it's cloudy and it's going to rain. and you always side with her. And again, that's psychological separation that many, the other phrase you will hear a lot of times is women saying to their men, I'm not your mother. I'm not your mother. You know, which is like a stab right in the gut, you know.
Well, what about those men that say nothing? I think that's even worse.
Well, see, most of the men that I work with were raised by fathers who either said nothing or yelled and was abusive. So you only got two models there, and if you don't want to be yelling and abusive, you go silent. And that's the one thing, Larry, that women have been telling me for 35 years in therapy, and women would tell me in my relationships is, you've got to open up and tell me what's going on inside. And most of us just were not trained to do that.
Well, you just probably answered my next question, which was why have men previously avoided this subject? And there you go. They're emotionally, example-wise, not set up or capable to even address that. Probably oblivious to it altogether. And I'm sure that.
One of the things, our DNA has us as men, which has not been that long ago, to be hunters and gatherers. Hunters and gatherers and warriors, if they talked a lot, they either died or they didn't bring the game home for supper. So what I've been telling men and women is that you and I and the guy in the sound booth, we were raised by quiet men. And that we're taught from early on, listen, you can't be talkative and telling what's going on and what you're feeling in a foxhole, right? That's one reason why they don't draft 45-year-olds, because by the time we're 45, that's beginning to wake up again. You tell an 18-year-old, go take that hill, the 18-year-old go, yep, you got it. You tell a 45-year-old man to go take that hill, he might say something like, could we talk about it? Could I tell you how I feel about doing that?
So if there were a bunch of 45-year-olds with Custer, that might not have been the last stand, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, they just said, you know what, no thanks.
Yeah.
I feel this is not in my best interest.
I think it would have been a hasty retreat by some, to say the least. But I get you. Is there a father-daughter dynamic as well? Are there any similarities? I mean, obviously, you always hear the thing, father, really pays, not hovers. I never think of it as hovering. They're just very, always on point with those daughters. Anything is said or done.
Always going to be daddy's little girl.
Yeah, the new guy, the new boyfriend shows up, and they're right on top of it.
Well, there's competition, again, with that adolescent boy. See, if you got a mother-son dynamic, and you got a daughter in the family, well, then the daughter becomes a lot of the time the surrogate parent to the man, to the father. And then the father keeps letting, I have a client that he keeps saying his little girl needs his help financially, needs him to tell her how to do things. And I thought for when we first started talking, he was talking about a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old. And I was just kind of agreeing with him, And then I said, now, wait a minute. Let me get some clarity. How old is your little girl? She'll be 45 her next birthday. So.
And then, unless they are very substantially wealthy, in my opinion, and leave them a nice little nest egg, then that person will endure a tremendous downturn, in my opinion, because they are emotionally incapable of dealing not only with the money train's demise, the death of the parent, and probably in many other ways are not able to, we have a leaky pipe. Well, what do I do? Well, I don't know. Daddy took care of it. Or, they're going to turn this off. Well, he took care of it. I mean, it's, grow up already.
They're going to look for a daddy figure. But at the same time, we're so complex, they're also going to resent the daddy figure because they are 45 years old. They want to be an adult, and yet they're not prepared. So it's a rock in a hard place kind of thing. Well, I fixed the pipe. Well, yeah, but before you did, you talked to me like I was an idiot, you know, and I'm not an idiot. I got a PhD in economics, you know, so it's both. But we've all heard this thing, you know, a lot of times in the movies or the television stuff. Somebody will say, yeah, she's got real daddy issues.
Exactly. John Lee joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic. John, of course, best-selling author. I mentioned before one of his books, The Flying Boy, a tremendous New York Times bestseller back in the day. Also self-help pioneer. I just wanted you to embellish a little bit on the gentleman you mentioned earlier. I think a lot of people are not familiar with him. I wanted you to talk a little bit about him, because obviously he was sounds like a mentor to you, but also a very important individual in what you folks called the men's movement.
Right. Yeah, Robert Bly, he's 90 now, but he essentially spearheaded this new thing after the women's movement called the men's movement. He's one of the major American poets and storytellers. And somehow, because it was right time, right place, and he is an excellent speaker and storyteller and one of the best poets that's ever been, somehow the men started coalescing around him. And what his theory was, which became mine also, he and I worked together, co-taught workshops for 20 years, is that men need to go inside because we've been outside or externally focused for thousands of years. And so it's time for men to go in and deal with some wounds, get some healing, see what pains and hurts are there, and be able to express them, be able to articulate them appropriately. Like one of my books is called Facing the Fire, Experiencing and Expressing Anger Appropriately. Most men, if you said to them, do you have any anger at your mother? The answer 99 times out of 100 until they do the work that Robert Bly spearheaded would say, no, she was the greatest mother on the planet. And so he, in the 80s and 90s, in early 1990, 91, he was on Time Magazine's most influential 100 people in America. That this thing, we were getting crowds of thousands of men all over the world that wanted to start doing some of this work.
A couple of things on you again from doing my research or whatever. You mentioned the first one, you an adult child of an alcoholic. So obviously, and that was primarily your dad, or were both parents?
It was like one time when I took my niece to recovery. She was 13 and put her in treatment, and the intake counselor said, so, hon, do you have any alcoholism in your family history? And my 13-year-old niece looked at him and said, oh, my Lord, where does it start?
Yeah.
Because our uncles, our grandparents, my father, you know, and me, you know, I'm a recovering alcoholic.
You know, an interesting statistic I just learned about not more than a couple of days ago before our taping, that among millennials, and I'm going to say in that late 20 to early 30 age, that there seems to be a tremendous, not a slight, uptick in alcoholism. And of course, I was, you know, growing up when I did, I would say, well, you know, it's probably, you know, the Depression back in those days for those that many are no longer with us, but then the war years, the post-war years. Again, I guess it can happen no matter whether good times or bad. Not that I'm saying that these times are perfect, but I'm just saying, what do you attribute that to? And I would think that that's a concern that you would share.
Right. Well, one of the things is that the ages between 16 and 24 has the highest rate of suicide and the Vietnam vets, 20 vets commit suicide every day. Part of this is because of the loneliness and the disconnect that's going on now between, even though we have these devices that gives us the illusion that we're all connected, what we're seeing is that real connection is just not there, and the despair and the depression is running rampant. There's studies that show from the last 100 years that more people are experiencing depression now than ever had. Of course, back in the old days, even if you were depressed, you never spoke about it, let alone go to a therapist.
Well, that I would assume that's where the drinking would come in, or now perhaps, opioid addiction, hardcore drugs, whatever. And you bring up a valid point. I'm always preaching this in my own personal dealings. Is I come from an upbringing where people would show up. Sometimes you almost knew they would come. Like I had a gentleman, I used to call him an uncle. He was like a cousin of my mom's, and he worked in the area. Used to work on Saturdays for half the day, and then Uncle Steve by 12:30 would always show up at the house. Now, if you show up at the house, people are like, "What are you doing here?" It's like, or if there's an issue, well, pick up a phone if you're 100 miles or 1,000 miles away. Now it's like, oh, let me get my my little crippled thumbs working on the device. I always say if I could have come back as something else, I would have been either an audiologist or a hand doctor, because I would have been a rich man.
That's right. Well, see, the thing about it is that this disconnect is happening so much, but alcohol, drugs, pornography, work addiction, gambling, sex addiction, all those will numb the pain temporarily that people carry around for decades, not even knowing it's there, because we're such an addicted society that we have plenty of addictions to numb that pain out for us, and rather than us sobering up and looking at it and dealing with it.
A couple of other facts about John. This one I didn't know. Hopefully, he doesn't mind us sharing it. Hate to fly. You're actually the second guest in a row that I've had. It must be a trend that has issues with flying. Is that something you've overcome, or no?
Well, now let's do two levels of it.
Okay.
Let's do the current level,
okay,
which flying is nothing more than the Greyhound bus in the sky.
Wow. Okay.
It's crowded, it's dirty, it's uncomfortable. But early on, my parents and I were in a thunderstorm in the 50s, and we almost died. And so for years, man, the last thing I want to do is get on a plane. Wouldn't you know it, come 30 years old, I'm making my living doing 40, 50 cities a year. So I had to get over it.
So you were like Little Richard back in the 50s. He converted, became like a preacher for a few years because he saw something on that plane. I don't know if he had a Twilight Zone moment, but for a while he was totally freaked out about flying. So totally understand. Love poetry. Do you write poetry yourself?
I do. I have 3 books of poetry that I've put out over the years. I got a new one coming out in October. Again, that was Robert Bly's influence to a large degree, but I also taught literature and religious studies for 12 years at the University of Alabama and the University of Texas. So I sort of never really knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, which is a trait of what I call flying boys, boys in a man's body who can't quite grow up. So I just tried to major and stay in college forever if I could.
I think there's a lot of us out there like that. And you yourself also went through some chemical dependency in the early 80s. Again, would you attribute that, again, going back to the alcoholism problem in the family, or is it,
Well, growing up, I swore I'd never be an alcoholic because I saw how much damage, it had done. And then by 13, I was using the same stuff to medicate the pain and the hurt, and I kept using it up until my 30s, on and off. And then I even relapsed about 18, 19 years ago. So I've got an 18-year sobriety now. But see, adult children of alcoholics will either, and this is a factual number, 90% of adult children of alcoholics will either become an alcoholic or marry one.
Wow. All right. In the remaining moments we have with John Lee, I thought this question up and I said, I'm just curious to see what he comes up with. Any historical figures that you never had any contact with, in your opinion, that could have used this book?
Oh man, that's a good question.
Like I thought, maybe Napoleon, but I don't know. I was thinking about something the other day that made me think of him. I don't know why. Julius Caesar. I mean, I guess we'd have to really delve into their upbringing.
That mythological character, Parsifal, could have used the book. But the truth is this mother-son dynamic has been going on, forever. It's just never really been discussed very much. When you see this book of mine, what you'll see if you start exploring this issue is there's almost no books out there that deals with mother-son wounds. Lots of father-son wounds. But I'm going to tell the audience the best, quickest little book. It's written by a man named Robert Johnson. His little book is called He. H-E. And it's all about the mother-son relationship, the enmeshment. And that little book has sold tens of millions of copies. For people who don't like to read big, long books, pick that book up, He, and you'll see some of the things we've talked about, but he goes into some others that we haven't had time to talk about.
You talked about in the '80s how this men's movement really took hold and there was a surge. Then I got the impression from something I read that you said that then it kind of has faded a little bit. I mean, it sounds to me like this should be something that should be being talked about even more, not just by yourself but by others. Who in this 21st century of a younger generation is kind of carrying the torch? Are there any folks in your kind of mold that are like really writing about this and talking about it out in the public?
That's the problem. Somehow or another, young men have not come into the foreground with books. There's people 50, 60, 70 out there, but it's one of those things where, now here's the good news. The good news is that the men's movement has spread out its information into families, husbands, sons, mothers, that doesn't even know where that material has come from. But they're still getting to use it. See, when we were talking in the 80s, nobody got paternal leave, those kinds of things. Nobody thought of how important it was for the father to be intimately bound up with the family. So they're getting it sort of secondhand. Now, here's the other good news. There's a group it's called the Mankind Project. That's probably the most viable organization that's still working in these areas, but instead of working with 1,000 men in an audience like Robert Bly would do, they're working in small groups of 10 and 20, not only in this country, but others. But then there's other authors, Aaron Kipnis, Jed Diamond, Robert Moore, before he passed. There's men out there doing stuff, but the media is not paying attention to it like they did in the 80s and 90s.
John Lee joining us for the hour and our remaining moments here on Studio 411, the book Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic. JohnLeeBooks.com for more information. In the remaining moments, I wanted to ask you about this because something in your readings or in talking to you before we got together today, I was just curious. Any thoughts on Reverend Billy Graham, who passed away in 2018? A guy that, even as a kid growing up in the Northeast, I was always amazed. And while I wouldn't watch the entire sermon, which was like every month or 2 or 3 months on television, they would show, him speaking, and just seemed like a man that no matter. You didn't have to be whether you were Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, atheist. There was something about this man that drew, drew people to him. Any thoughts on him, or am I just going up the wrong tree here?
Well, that's okay, since we, don't want to stay on the track too long. Billy Graham was America's preacher, that's for sure, at least in my generation. We watched him on television, and, anybody of any denomination would do that. And this was, before these 10,000, 20,000 facility churches was happening. If Billy Graham had started, the other guy, Rick Warren, he's now sort of taken that spot for many, many people. What the men's movement is about, and the recovery movement is about still, is an inclusive format. We want everybody of every persuasion, color, religion, ethnic. That's where you go, and you don't get preached to exactly, but you do get a spiritual edification that a lot of people won't go to church or synagogue to get these days.
There you go. And I wanted to say before we take leave of John and you folks here who tuned in today on Studio 411, he's entered into a partnership with our friends Robert and Carol Teitelbaum, Teitelbaum Press. They have re-released, I guess, mainly on audiobook, some of John's earlier works. And again,
e-books, that are available on Kindle and other platforms. They took some of my books that were out of print and now have put them back out there with some really great success, and I'm very grateful to them for that.
Very good. And we are grateful for you to take time from your busy schedule to join us today on Studio 411. The book, Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic, Resetting the Patterns of a Man's Life and Loves, John Lee. For more information, johnleebooks.com, published by Health Communications, Inc. John, hang in there. Thank you so much for spending the hour with us.
Thanks for having me, Larry, and sometime when you ain't got anything better to do, have me again.
Absolutely, absolutely. We thank you for joining us on Studio 411, and we will see you next time. Take care.